When approaching Sugarloaf Mountain, just outside of Campbellton, one can't help but notice two massive red circles with white crosses inside of them that are painted on the side of the gray sheer rock cliffs of the mountain. They commemorate a tragedy that occurred 100 years ago. When I was a kid in Tide Head, which is a little village just outside of Campbellton, I often asked what was the story behind the highly visible bright red crosses that remain painted on the side of Sugarloaf even today. The story I was told was that two sisters had been picking berries when they were surprised by a bear, and they ran away and fell off the side of the mountain to their deaths. But even when I was young, I began to realize that everyone I asked about the crosses had a different version of the story of what happened. The only constant theme was that two sisters had fallen to their deaths. So I decided to do a search through old news reports from that day and in the days after to try and figure out what really happened that led to these crosses on Sugarloaf Mountain.
You're listening to Backyard History, the hidden stories that happened in your own backyard, the podcast version of the weekly history column running in newspapers across the Maritimes, with your host and author, Andrew McLean.
On November 9th, 1924, two sisters, Dorval McLean and Lottie Ramsey, climbed Sugarloaf Mountain. Or, if you speak Mi'kmaq, which is a language spoken by Mi'kmaq, the mountain named Squatic. The oldest sister was Dorval. She was 21 years old and was married to Canadian National Railway employee Edward McLean. The early 1920s were a very difficult time, economically speaking, to live in Campbellton. It was a time of pretty desperate poverty, and her husband working for CN Rail was actually a really good job for the time. Dorval was also a new mother. She had a 7-month-old baby named Sterling. The younger sister, Lottie Ramsey, worked in a restaurant as a waitress, and she was either 17 or 19 years old. The Ramseys were not a wealthy family, and this was long before there was Medicare. Like many Campbelltonians back then, the Ramseys could not afford a doctor, which seems to be why there were some discrepancies about when Lottie had actually been born. Dr. McPherson, who was Campbellton's only doctor, also acted as the city's coroner. He was the one who filled out Lottie's death certificate, and he scribbled a note on the margins, which read,
"I don't remember seeing her before. I only saw her as a coroner."
This implies that she had likely been born at home without a doctor present, which was not exactly unusual back then, especially for poor families like the Ramseys. On that fateful day, the sisters had been planning on having a Sunday dinner with their parents, Sidney and Jane Ramsey. Present for that dinner would be Dorval's husband, Edmund, and her new baby, Sterling. Also attending dinner would be their two brothers, who still lived in Campbellton. The sisters' other siblings had, like many people in the impoverished North Shore, moved away to find work. One was living in Alberta, another had moved to Buffalo, New York, and another one had moved to England. Before dinner, though, the two sisters had set off to hike up Sugarloaf. It was a crisp, cold day, and there was a light dusting of snow falling. While Sugarloaf isn't exactly the biggest mountain in the Maritimes, it's really not that small either. At a little less than 1,000 feet high, it is a couple-hour hike up and back. While it's not super difficult to climb, it is somewhat strenuous. The first time that I ever climbed it, back when I was a kid, I got so tired that my mother had to carry me back down. Dorval and Lottie left to go climb Sugarloaf around 3:30 p.m. that November afternoon. Considering how early darkness falls in November, this is a surprisingly late hour to depart. The Campbellton Graphic newspaper later noted as much.
Leaving town about 4 o'clock, it would be nearly dark before the top was reached. It is supposed that on arriving there the two stood to admire the outlook.
By 8 o'clock, night had fallen. Dinner was cold, and the sisters had not returned. The family began to check in with relatives and neighbors to see if anyone had heard from them. The family almost certainly didn't have a phone, obviously not a cell phone, but even a landline, so they would have been walking house to house to knock on neighbors' doors and to ask people if they'd seen any sign of the two missing sisters. As word spread across town that the two sisters were missing, an ominous sense of alarm began to set in. Only 2 hours later, at 10 p.m., a large search party of volunteers had assembled and set off to climb Sugarloaf to search for the missing young women. It was a clear night with a bright moon, and illuminated by moonlight, the searchers continued looking for the sisters, but they found no sign of them. The search continued through the night, but found no sign of Dorval and Lottie. When dawn broke the next morning, the searchers quickly located 2 sets of footprints in the night's frost. According to the Campbellton graphic, the searchers
were able to follow the footprints in the slight snow and followed them to the cliff.
One set of searchers at the top of Sugarloaf, who were standing where the footsteps disappeared, called out to a second search party at the bottom of Sugarloaf to search below them at the bottom of the cliff. It was police constable brothers Andrew and William Smith who found Dorval's body first. Dorval's remains were quite badly mangled. From the injuries, the 2 police brothers figured that she had fallen headfirst from the top of Sugarloaf. Not long after, Lottie's body was eventually located. It was stuck high up in a tree. She was, according to the Campbellton Graphic newspaper,
not so badly injured, although death must have been instantaneous.
The 2 police constables called for blankets to wrap the sister's body in. Meanwhile, Campbellton's chief of police set off to the Ramsay household to deliver the tragic news. The parents were, by all accounts, completely inconsolable. As the news of the tragedy spread, a deep wave of mourning rippled through Campbellton. The Campbellton Graphic wrote,
"One of the saddest tragedies in the history of Campbellton was that of Sunday evening, when 2 bright young lives were lost in a most tragic manner."
2 days later, a joint funeral was held for the sisters, both of whom were well known and well liked. The Graphic wrote that the funeral
was one of the largest ever seen. A large number of autos, carriages, and people walking followed the funeral cortege to the rural cemetery. The services at the house were very impressive. The floral tributes were many and beautiful, showing the esteem in which the 2 young ladies were held.
Exactly what caused the young women to fall has always been shrouded in mystery, and it remains to this day a source of speculation in Campbellton. Sugarloaf was never considered to be very dangerous. In the days after the tragedy, reporters at the Campbellton Graphic newspaper tried to figure out if anyone had ever died on the mountain before. They went through old editions of their own newspaper, but they wrote that
during the many years that people have been climbing the Sugarloaf, this is the first accident of a serious nature, although a few years ago a man snowshoeing fell some distance and was slightly injured.
Notably, these local papers steadfastly avoided any kind of speculation whatsoever as to what caused the 2 sisters to fall. As far as they were concerned, it was just a simple local tragedy. That didn't stop people outside of Campbellton from speculating. I should note, though, that despite what I heard as a kid, which was that the sisters had been surprised by a bear, there's actually no mention of bear tracks in these news reports that I went through from the time. And remember how snow had fallen, so if there was a bear, people would probably have seen the tracks. And I'm absolutely sure that would have made the news. And besides, this was in November. Bears probably should have been hibernating by now anyways. While Campbellton's newspapers treated the tragedy sensitively and they avoided absolutely any kind of speculation about what caused the sisters to fall, other New Brunswick newspapers did offer their opinions on the matter. Fredericton's Daily Gleaner newspaper wrote,
"It has been surmised that the 2 young women must have been standing hand in hand when one slipped, dragging the other after her."
The Moncton Daily Times newspaper wrote,
"It is said that a piece fell off the mountain, and it is firmly believed that this is where the accident happened."
Meanwhile, in St. John, the Telegraph Journal wrote,
"The top of the precipice was very icy and slippery."
Those red crosses that can still be seen in Campbellton today that commemorate the two sisters were first painted on Sugarloaf the following spring. They were painted by Alex Johnson, who was a First World War veteran, and his brother Seeley. The Johnson brothers don't seem to have been particularly close to the sisters personally. They might not have actually even known them. But like many Campbelltonians, they were really shocked and they were really devastated by this tragedy. They seem to have been motivated to paint the crosses mostly because they were uniquely able to. They were young and they were fit enough to be able to get up there, and perhaps more importantly, the paint was free. Their father owned a shop that sold paint. Sydney and Jane Ramsay, the two young women's parents, were not consulted about painting the crosses, and they were definitely not happy about the tribute to their daughters. In fact, apparently they found it incredibly upsetting to have to look out of their own house at these massive red reminders of the places that their daughters died. Despite the parents' feelings on the matter, these two crosses have been repainted repeatedly over the years, and they are still very much visible today. As for Dorval's young son Sterling, who was only 7 months old when his mother tragically died, he also did not have a very happy ending. When he was only 17 years old, he left school to go enlist in the Second World War. Sterling fought his way across Europe. He helped the Canadian Army liberate peoples in Belgium and Netherlands. As the end of the war drew closer, the Canadians, including Sterling, were fighting in Nazi Germany. It was while fighting in Nazi Germany that Sterling McLean was killed on April 25th, 1945, only 13 days before the Second World War ended.
That was Backyard History with your host, Andrew McLean. Thanks for listening, and stay tuned for another hidden story that happened in your own backyard. Produced by Jordan Lozier.